Okay, welcome everyone. Today is part 2 of what's new in Oracle Apex 23.2 preview. This is a 4-part series, and this is the second of those 4 parts. And we've got an exciting lineup of information today. I am Jason Haynes. I am a product manager for Oracle Apex. If you haven't ever seen me before, or another video that I've been presenting on or hosting an office hours for, but let's get started with some good information ahead of our content today. So if you haven't been to apex@oracle.com lately, now's the time to go. If you go to apex@oracle.com, you're going to see that Apex 23.2 is out as preview on that instance. You can try out all the features that are being discussed in the series and also look at the What's New page for Apex 23.2 and see all the new features and even demonstrate it yourself when you request your own workspace to get started. So again, the recap here on the actual 5-part series we have for the new features of Apex 23.2. Last week, we covered a lot of new features with Mark Seats, and today we're going to be talking about workflow, and then there's some other parts coming up over the next couple of weeks. But last week's presentation, the recording should be available in the next week or so, but all of these will be eventually published and available on demand. Also be aware that we have the events application available from apex@oracle.com, and the events page is your opportunity in the community to submit particular events to be pasted or posted on this calendar, whether they happen to be user group sessions, conferences that you're aware of, anything that has to do with gathering people in the community for Apex events should be submitted here, and then you'll be able to see it on the actual calendar and be aware of what's happening in the following months. You can look through ahead of different events that have been posted and published. Further, when you actually post something on here and you request notifications, push notifications to be enabled on the app, and anytime a new one is published, you'll get that push notification on your device to let you know that there's a new event. So this is a real exciting application that the community can engage with as well to be kept in the know. Yesterday, I attended the Michigan Oracle User Summit Conference. It was a great conference, and you can see it's listed right there at the bottom of that calendar as of the 25th. So today, in this part 2 of what's new in Apex 23.2, we have special guest Ananya Chatterjee and Ralph Mueller. They're going to talk about what their team has put together with workflow and demonstrate it. And it's just a very exciting topic in Apex because typically doing things of this nature, we're a little bit of, there's actually a lot of work to put some of this stuff together, and their new work they've done on these features being baked into the product makes it so that anyone from a low-code perspective can do complex workflow and make your applications really capable of doing some very advanced and sophisticated things. And it's just a very exciting time, yet again, to be an Apex developer. From there, just also know that we do have blogs that are being posted, and we have apex@oracle.com/blog as a short link to learn more about simplified business process management using Apex workflow and using action tasks with Oracle Apex 23.2. So bear that in mind. Take a look when you can. Over to you, Ananya. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome, everybody. Today we will talk about workflow, the new feature as part of Apex 23.2. The agenda for today is where we briefly walk you through the various features of workflow, as well as talk about what comes ahead in the workflow roadmap. So what is Apex Workflow? With Apex Workflow, we are finally providing a way to declaratively create your business process using the Apex low-code application development platform. You can model your business process by identifying the steps in the business process. You have a visual designer, workflow designer, which experience-wise is very similar to the page designer, which all of you already know about. The experience would be very similar to that, where you can model your workflow activities, which are nothing but steps in the workflow. You can connect those activities together conditionally or unconditionally. And you will also have a tree-like experience similar to the page designer. I will briefly show all of that as part of my demo. Besides that, we have the workflow console, which is a generated page, much similar to other pages that you can generate using the Create Page wizard. The workflow console allows at runtime the participant of a workflow to monitor the progress of a workflow instance, also perform certain operations on the workflow, which I will come to as part of my demo. The workflow process type plugin is the third component available as part of workflow. With this process type plugin, you can make workflow a page process so that any page in your application through the click of a button can start the workflow. We also allow other operations on a workflow instance. For example, suspending a workflow, that is pausing a workflow, or resuming a paused workflow, retrying a faulted workflow, updating certain data in the workflow. All these operations are also declaratively made possible through the page process plugin. We have the workflow runtime engine, of course, for the execution of the activities in the workflow. And last but not the least, we have public APIs as well as views for interacting with the workflow. The workflow is an extensive feature, and there are many new terms and terminologies that you will gradually get acquainted to. I hope to give you as much as possible without overwhelming everybody in this session. So as part of my, before I go to the demo, this is how the workflow designer typically looks. As you can see, it is very similar in its look and feel to the page designer, where you have a central pane, which has a layout, which we call the diagram builder. On the left-hand side, you have the tree structure for showing all your activities of the workflow and other workflow artifacts. On the right-hand side, you have the properties pane, where you can define and set specific attributes of the workflow artifacts. So what you see at the central pane or the diagram builder is where you can visualize your workflow model. At the bottom of the diagram builder, you can see a palette or the activities palette from where you can drag and drop the different types of activities. Depending on the kind of steps you want to perform as part of your workflow, you can choose the activity type. Each of these activities are nothing but process type plugins that you already have been using as page processes. Many of them are exposed as workflow activities. For example, human task create allows you to create an approval task, and now with 23.2 also action tasks, which I will talk about also briefly as part of my demo. You can also create an invoke API type of workflow activity for executing a package procedure or a function. You can send an email as part of a workflow activity. These are the existing process type plugins, which are native plugins, which you can drag and drop and connect together as part of your workflow. Besides these activities, we also have some new activities which we have introduced exclusively for workflow. So these are the workflow start activity. So every workflow needs to have exactly one start activity. That's how the workflow knows where to begin. We have a workflow end activity. You can see here. Let me zoom this a bit for your convenience. So this is the workflow end activity that you see here with a square sign. And the workflow end is also something that you need to have at least one of. You can, however, have more than one end activities depending on your flow logic. And the end state can be of two different types. You can have a completion type of end, or you can have a termination kind of end. The essential difference being that complete is the smooth, correct path of the workflow, and terminate is an exception path of the workflow. So I will go through all of this as part of my demo in greater details. This is just to give you a brief overview of how the workflow designer looks like. Let me go to the next slide. The next slide talks about the Apex workflow development cycle. I will come back to this, in fact, as part of my demo, because I would like to first take you through the demo. And as I walk through the demo, I introduce you to the various artifacts of workflow, which I think will make it a little less confusing and easier to navigate through. So as part of my demo today, I have chosen a very typical example in the clinical field, that is booking doctor appointments or medical appointments. So the use case here is that a patient rings up the hospital management staff to book an appointment with a doctor, and how the hospital management staff takes it from there. So in order to understand this use case, any kind of business process has to be first split up into different kinds of business steps. You might want to identify the atomic steps or indivisible steps in your workflow, and then only then convert them into activities. For this purpose, I have made this chart here to explain which of the steps in this workflow, in this application are manual, which means it requires human interaction, and which of them can be automated. So for not only the medical appointment process, any complex business process like content management, requisitions, purchase order, supply chain, all of them will have some complexities where you can identify the parts that can be automated and identify the parts which are manual. So in here, you will find the listing of all the steps and also the classification of whether they are manual and automatic. All the automatic steps automatically become parts of the workflow. The remaining are needing human interaction, and I have also mentioned which actor is going to act on which step. For example, calling the hospital for appointment is something that the patient does. The hospital management staff logs into the application and submits this request, and this is what fires the workflow. The workflow computes whether that doctor at that requested date is available or not. If the doctor is not available, you will send a no appointment regret letter or a mail to the patient. If the doctor is available, you send an approval request to the doctor, which can be converted to a human task. So this activity automatically tells us that the doctor needs to act on it, so it must involve an approval task. So in this way, we slowly identify all the steps in our business process and find out which is manual and automatic, and create a flowchart, which is the next step. So here we have the flowchart of the doctor appointment workflow. Before showing you the workflow, I show you the flowchart here with its actors and the steps. So as you can see, there are 4 actors here. The main actor in the middle is the workflow, which consists of all the automatic steps. On the left-hand side, you have the hospital management representative who submits the workflow. On the right-hand side, you have the doctor and the patient. So at the very first step, you have to compute the doctor's availability. Based on the decision whether it's available or not, you send out a mail or you send an appointment request, which the doctor has to approve or reject. In the next step, you again have to make a decision based on whether the doctor approved or rejected the request. In case the doctor approved the request, you enter this appointment in the system of records. And then you evaluate whether this patient had made a visit already with this doctor, and in that case, you do not charge the fees for the patient. So again, another decision is made here based on whether this is a follow-up request or not. In both cases, you update the details of the fees in the appointment record, and you raise an invoice request for the patient. This again is an approval task, not an approval task. Sorry, I was wrong there. It is an action task here because the patient really does not need to approve anything. The patient only needs to confirm or complete this invoice, saying that in case it's a paid visit, makes the payment and then says I've completed and I confirm this invoice. If it's a zero fees kind of request, then the patient simply confirms the invoice. So this is where action tasks come in really handy because you don't have any approve or reject scenario here. You simply need to complete that task. After this, once the visit has happened, you wait. The workflow is waiting. Here you see a wait symbol here. The workflow is waiting for the visit to really happen. After the visit has happened, another feedback request is raised for the patient to record the patient's experience, overall experience with the hospital. And based on this experience, a thank you note is sent to the patient. You will notice small clocks next to these activities, raise invoice request and raise feedback request, which means that these activities do have timeouts configured, which means that if the invoice was not completed by the patient or confirmed by the patient, there will be a no appointment email sent to the patient. On the other hand, if the feedback request is not completed by the patient, there is no thank you note coming in for that patient and the workflow is completed. Now let's go to the right-hand side of this slide and show you how each of these steps in the workflow is going to look in the workflow designer. So from a flowchart point of view, you can readily visualize it in the workflow designer as is. And for each of the activities you have identified in your flowchart, you create the workflow activities in your workflow designer. With that, I will take you to the demo. So this is my application. It's called Doctor Appointment Made Easy. And at the very beginning, I show you where the workflow resides. The workflow resides under shared components, workflows and automations. You have a new entry called workflows. With approvals component, we had task definitions here. With workflows, we have introduced this section. This will take you to the workflow reports, where if you have already created a workflow or workflows, they will show up here and you can click on them. If there is nothing created, you can create a new workflow from here. So this is the workflow that I was talking you through in my slides, and you will see it here also. Let me reduce the zoom level for everybody to see. So this is the doctor appointment workflow. When you expand the workflow, you will see something called parameters at the very beginning. Parameters are nothing but inputs to the workflow. Your workflow here requires certain inputs. And these are the inputs that are passed on to the workflow via the page process when the hospital management staff clicks on the submit button, providing the patient details and the appointment request date. So these become parameters to the workflow. And each of these parameters are read-only inputs, which means that none of the workflow activities can modify their value. These are supposed to be only read and used for processing. With parameters, we have data type support, which means that our parameters can have different data types, number, varchar2, Boolean, and the different varieties of timestamp. Under the workflow, we see something called 1.0 dev. So what is this? This is what we mean by workflow development lifecycle model. When a workflow is first created, it is always created in a state of in development, which you see highlighted here on the right-hand side in the properties pane. A developer typically would want to make several modifications to the workflow model, its properties, its conditions, before the workflow is actually ready for runtime usage. So this is what we mean by in development state, which means every part of the workflow can be freely edited by the developer. It also means that the developer can run this workflow in a developer session and test all the aspects of the workflow without requiring any formal specification of workflow participants. So you see here on the left-hand pane, something called participants, and you see nothing defined here. And you will still see that the workflow can be ran from the developer session because it is in development. Workflow participants are definitely required when the workflow is activated, which means it brings it to the active mode. In active mode, we allow only limited editing of the workflow model because it is supposed to be production ready. And for anything that is production ready, we would discourage any kind of drastic modification to any of the activities or their settings. So here, as I defined, we have the different kinds of activities here. And this is the activities palette from where you can drag and drop activities into the palette and join them together through the connections. So the very first connection here, activity you see here is compute doctor availability. Its type is invoke API. And this is where you can see all the process type plugins which are supported as workflow activities. In fact, if you have a custom process type plugin, you can define it to be supported for workflow activities, and then it will also show up here in the component palette that you see below. Right now, I do not have anything configured as a custom process type plugin, which is why you do not see anything here. What is interesting here is this new activity called switch activity that we have defined here. This is something that we have introduced with workflow. This activity process type plugin was not available before 23.2. Its specific use case is for workflow, and switch is allowing us to conditionally define branches to the different activities. If you notice the difference between the transition or the connection that went from compute doctor availability to doctor available, this was something unconditional, which means that after the execution of this activity or step, the next step automatically is the doctor available step. Whereas from doctor available, The next step is not unconditional, rather it is conditional, which is defined through a switch. A switch actually maps to a decision box in a flowchart, plainly speaking. We support different kinds of switches. There are 4 different kinds, in fact. In my demo, I have used 2 of them. The simplest one being true-false check, where you can check the result of a Boolean. You can make a Boolean comparison, and you can support the different kinds of conditions like rows returned, rows not returned, expression, function body. Here I have used the condition type as workflow variable equal to value. And with this, I must talk about workflow variables and workflow data in general. I already introduced you to one kind of workflow data, which is the parameters, but they are only inputs, which means we cannot change their values. Workflows also have some kind of data known as workflow variables. You can consider them to be a global data, which means every activity of the workflow has access and the power to modify the value of this kind of data. So what are the variables we have here? We have something called the availability. Availability is a Boolean variable, which means its value is initialized to null, which means that at the time the workflow starts, its value is null. But this compute doctor availability procedure does precisely that. It returns the value of the availability. So if I expand this compute doctor availability invoke API, you will see that the function result is mapped to this workflow variable item. This is the workflow item picker where you can pick any of the workflow items, and we have chosen it to be the availability item. So with this, the result of the compute doctor availability becomes mapped to the availability variable and is available. So the value of the availability, we also support format masks here. The true value of availability is available and the false value is busy. So here, when we come back to the switch, if the availability is set to busy, this is the kind of true-false check we are performing. So the false path, so this is when condition is true, which means when your availability is set to busy, you will get a regret email. You will send a regret email to the patient. If your availability is set to available, you will request appointment from the doctor. With this, we come to the next activity, which is a human task create activity, where you are talking to the task definitions or your approvals component, and you're raising an approval request or an approval task for the doctor to approve. So from where if you see here, we already have an idea of the how task definitions are used in page processes, and this experience is not quite different from how you use task definitions in page processes. And as you know that there is something called details primary key item, which binds the particular approval task to a single record in a system of records. So here we want that request to go to a particular doctor and not to every doctor in the hospital. So how do we do that? We do that using DNO. What is DNO? So DNO is a column in the doctor's table. So how does workflow know what DNO is? Because we have not defined it in parameters, we have not defined it in workflow variables. For this, precisely for this purpose, we have something called additional data. In additional data, you can define some other source of data besides what you are defining as part of your parameters and variables. If you want to access some other system of records, you can do that, and that data will be available. Columns of that data or table or SQL query will be available throughout the lifetime of that workflow instance. So by all activities of the workflow. So here we are specifying the additional data as a doctor table. And that is why DNO, or the doctor number, which is a column in the doctor table, gets automatically available in this particular doctor available switch. Sorry, not here, but in the request appointment, we can pass this so that the approval request gets generated only for that particular doctor. You will also find 2 additional settings coming in the task definitions named outcome and owner. So with this, the task, after it's getting approved or rejected, the outcome of the task can come back to the workflow, as well as the information about who approved or rejected that workflow. So both of these, moment you add a human task type of workflow activity, these 2 variables get auto-generated here, called approver and outcome. and they become readily available for you. Both of them are initialized to null because when the workflow starts, they do not have any value. But whenever you have a human task that got approved or rejected, the variables will contain the correct value. And the utility of that comes in the following activity, which is the switch activity, which can evaluate the outcome and then define the next steps. So if the task outcome is approved, here if you notice, I have used a different switch type, check workflow variable, which is a very convenient switch type, which allows you to compare the value of any workflow variable at that point of time with another value. So here I'm comparing the task outcome, and I have two branches. And in the branches, we have the conditions defined. If the workflow variable task outcome is equal to approved, then you confirm the appointment, which means you enter the record in the appointments table. If it is not approved, you again send a no appointment email. So this is how the switch type is very, very convenient and powerful and allows you a declarative way to conditionally define which step you want to perform under which conditions. After this, we have the next switch, next decision point where we want to decide whether this is a follow-up visit or not. So this is the switch type called this. Again, we are doing a true-false check, and we have named it free consultation. We are doing a conditional evaluation of a workflow variable called free. But when I showed you the workflow variables here, there is nothing called free here. What is free then? Free is an activity variable. This is another kind of data that your workflow supports at the activity level. So you can compare the workflow variables to global variables and activity variables to local variables, which means that the scope of this variable is limited to this particular activity. The value of this variable will not last after the activity, this particular activity has completed executing. So it comes in handy if we do not want a variable to stay scoped for the entire workflow for the rest of the activities, and we want to free some variables. This is a good way to do that. So here we have a variable called activity variable called free, which calculates whether there is an entry in the appointments table for this particular patient-doctor combination with a request date that is within the last 7 days. You can use your logic here. This is just a demo purpose logic that I have used to determine whether this is a free consultation or not. If it's a free consultation, then we do not update the fees. If it's a free consultation, then we update the fees. Anyway, the fees is a variable that is initialized to a static value of 0. So we let it stay that way. But if it's not a free consultation, we update the fees and we set it to 500. And then we send an email to the patient saying that we have raised an invoice for you. So please approve or please confirm this invoice for us. Here we have a small timeout branch, which is also very interesting. So all the activities can support a kind of timeout kind of transition. And you see, this is that timeout transition. And the timeout transition leads to a no appointment email. And in the timeout configuration, where is the timeout value configured? It is configured at the activity level itself, where you have a deadline section. Here I have interval of 2 days. So the invoice must be confirmed within the 2 days before, in order to be actually processed and for the visit to happen. If this invoice has been confirmed, then you update the appointment payment and then you wait for the visit to happen. Here we have a wait activity. The wait activity here for the demo purpose, I have kept a static value. Ideally, what you can do is you can have a SQL query which is based on the request date or the request date entry in the appointment table itself, so that you know that whenever the request date has elapsed, only then you want the wait activity to be completed and progress to the next activity. So wait is a very powerful activity that allows a deliberate pause in your workflow execution. We again have a human task of action task type here. And finally, you again have a send email note over here. So this is in brief the workflow, how the workflow looks. I will now run you through this workflow. So this is the workflow here. I will log in as Steve, who is a hospital management staff here. So I submit a new appointment. I enter the patient details here. I'm using my email ID so that I can later hopefully show you some mail coming in. Let me choose tomorrow's time. I have configured the problem and the doctor. This is a typical Apex use case, nothing to do with workflow. And I submit. This book appointment is what actually starts the workflow. Because I'm initiator of a workflow, I have the workflow console created for me. I will later show you how to create workflow console depending on the different kinds of participants. But the basic use case is as an initiator of the workflow, you can define a workflow console of type initiated by me. The experience is very similar to if you have used unified task lists as part of approvals component. It's very similar to that. So this is the initiated by me for workflow console. And here I see the workflow that I just started, and it's in active state over here. I can see the workflow appointment details here. I can see what are the activities that have completed already. I can see that the start activity, compute doctor availability activity got completed. The doctor was available and now it's waiting for the doctor. I can also see the variables, the value of the variables that are already present, and the variables that have not yet been initialized are blanked. I can also look at the parameters with which the workflow got started. I can look at the history of the workflow, which shows that the instance was created. I can click on the individual activities to see their history as well. So let me now go and log in as the doctor, which is Anna Chat, and approve this request. For this, we will use the approvals component framework of unified task list. So I have this doctor tasks area, which is nothing but a unified task list. And here I can see that I have an appointment for Rajesh on 27th October, 8 p.m. and I approve it. Now that it's approved, I log back in as Steve again, just to see how far my workflow has progressed. View appointment workflow. It's still active, but I see there are large number of activities that have been added since I last checked in here. I see that there is is a free consultation or not. That I will know that this is a free consultation, and that's because I already here Rajesh already did have one workflow completed before the demo. So this is why you see there are no fees charged for Rajesh here. And you see that the outcome has come as approved and the approver is Anna Chat. And these are the values that came back from the approved task back to the workflow. And now an invoice has been raised for Rajesh to confirm. And this is where we will see the action task coming in handy. I log in as Rajesh. I have a patient's appointment and feedback section where I have a patient's task area, which is another unified task list for the patient to work on. So you see, this is the doctor name. There is no fees charged. And I say, I confirm this. And you see, unlike approve and reject, because this is an action task, you see something called complete over here. So that's all you need to do. You need to complete this task. That's all that you that's the only action that you can perform on such tasks. Let me see if I received a mail already. So you see, I received an appointment. The consultation charge was given here, an invoice has been raised. So this was the email that got sent, and I have already completed that invoice. Now, I had defined a 2 minutes interval time for the patient to relieve the feedback. But if I do not want to wait for that time, I will come here in this page, which I will describe later. So you see, this is the one that I'm talking about, provide feedback for 27th October. So here, this link is allowing me to interfere with the workflow. And I say, yes, I want to provide a feedback before itself. So this is the one, the feedback for consultation on 27th October, which means that I did not wait for that wait activity at all. Instead, I interfered with the workflow and raised a way to interrupt and progress to the next level, which was leaving the feedback. So here I can leave the feedback for this experience. And I said experience was excellent. And I complete. This also is an action task for the patient to perform. It's not an approval or rejection kind of scenario at all. And I complete this. Now, if I log back in as Steve, and try to look at how my workflow is doing, I will see that it is completed here with all the activities shown. So after this, I want to go back and take you to the task definitions and to show how the action task looks a little bit different from the other approval tasks. So as you have seen, there are 3 different tasks that we used in this workflow, and they are all defined under the task definitions, of which you see the appointment request that we raised for the doctor was an approval task. Task type is something that we introduced in 23.2. Before this, we only had approval kind of tasks. Now we have something called action task. So the raise invoice and request feedback are action tasks, which we did for the patient to perform any kind of invoice, confirming the invoice or requesting the feedback from the patient. So how did we work with these task definitions? Basically, what we did was, here we defined the parameters for this task. We did not do much here. We have the appointment date, patient description, patient name. All of this is passed from the workflow parameters to the task definition, as I showed in the workflow itself. So I expanded the invoke API workflow activity for you. Let me now go back and expand some of the human tasks for you to show how the parameters are passed to them. So if you come here, this is the request appointment is the first human task activity here. And here we have the parameters, and we are mapping them to the workflow parameters here. Here we are doing consultation for where we are the problem description is passed, the patient name is passed, and the appointment date is passed. So even for the confirm appointment, the parameters were, sorry, this is not a human task. Let me go back to the next human task activity. Here, the doctor name is a static value. This is not coming from the workflow parameter, but this is coming from the additional data that we defined for this workflow. So with this, I believe you got a brief idea about how you can define complex business processes in a very simple manner, by first identifying the business steps, breaking it into atomic steps, and then mapping it to the different kinds of activities, whether it's a procedure, whether it's an email sending, whether it's a push notification, whether it's a switch or decision. And last but not the least, I will now try to show you a little bit about how participants are important in a workflow. Because this workflow is in development state, it did not require any participants to start it. But if I want to activate this workflow, if as a developer, I'm 100% sure about how this workflow has been modeled, and I now want to move it to production, I will want to activate the workflow. So for doing that, I can activate it. So here I get a warning like the version must at least have one owner to be activated. So I need to define an owner here in order, and that I can do through participant section. So I can do a create participant over here. I can say that, and I can give a static value of, and I can save it here. Now that I have a valid workflow owner, it will allow me to activate this workflow. Here also I get notified that if this workflow already has an active version, it will be deactivated. Luckily, our workflow is brand new. It does not have any active version. It will not be, nothing will be deactivated. So we do an OK over here. The workflow has become active. But if you suddenly realize that, no, I forgot to add something here, you can use the undo button over here and come back to the in development state. Otherwise, if you save this, you already have this in active state. So once the workflow is in active state, you will not be able to run it in developer session anymore. The controls will be authorized. For example, the workflow owner the initiator can always start any active application user can initiate the workflow and also terminate it. As a workflow owner, the added advantage you have is you can retry a workflow which was faulted at runtime through the workflow console. When an active workflow can be deactivated or duplicated. So suppose you now want to make some changes to this version and release a new version of this workflow. So this is what version control is about. So you duplicate this workflow. When you duplicate a workflow, the duplicate version is always created in development state. So this is, you see the duplicated workflow over here is in development state. So with this, let me take you back a little bit to my slide where I was talking about the previous the workflow application workflow lifecycle model, because now it will make a little bit more sense to you. So let me. So I guess it was here. Yeah. So in the workflow development cycle, as I showed right now, you can use the activate button to move a workflow from in development to active state. And in the active state, you can, once it is active, you can duplicate as I showed you, and the new version becomes in development. When you again try to activate this in development version, it will obviously show you a notification that you already have an active version, which in this case is 1.0. Do you still want to go ahead? If you still want to go ahead, it will activate the new, the in development version, and it will silently deactivate the previously active version. When you deactivate a workflow version, it does not mean that it terminates all its running workflow instances. You might have workflow instances that were running based on this workflow version, which you just deactivated. Those workflow instances will still run till completion. Only difference is that you will not be able to start any new workflow instance based on that version. So one must exercise caution when activating or deactivating workflow versions, and do that only when they are 100% sure that they want this particular version to be the source of the metadata on the basis of which the activities will be executed at runtime. The other kind of participant that we had, let me take you back to my workflow demo instance. So the other kind of participant that we have is workflow administrator. The workflow administrator is sort of a super user for that workflow. So what can the workflow administrator additionally do for the workflow? The workflow administrator can additionally suspend and resume a workflow, which means you can, if a workflow is running at any point, you can suspend or resume that workflow. And the workflow administrator can update variables in the workflow. The variables that you were seeing here in the workflow, here, all these workflow variables, you will find an edit button next to these workflow variables, provided the workflow is in a suspended state or the workflow is faulted. So if the workflow has an abnormal pause or a normal pause, that is when the workflow administrator can go ahead and fix certain variables and allow the workflow to progress, and those variables will stay with the value that the admin provided. So the admin will supersede any kind of variables that were tweaked by any other activities of the workflow. So workflow administrator role should be given to somebody who really is supposed to be a super user for that workflow, who can come in and mitigate any kind of troubleshooting conditions in the workflow. So I guess I have more or less covered everything in this brief span of time. Workflow is extensive. It is a huge topic. And let me go back to the slide deck over here and show you a little bit about the workflow roadmap, as in what we have in the future. So this is the first release of workflow in Apex 23.2. With our forthcoming releases, we will expand and make this feature even more capable. We will add different new functionalities to the existing workflow, which I would invite my colleague Ralph to carry forward.
Thanks, Ananya. Can you jump to that slide? Yeah, so I mean, tons of questions. I'm still typing. So for the roadmap, as Ananya mentioned, this is basically our first step, into process automation with Apex. So naturally, we have like a pile of features, in the plan going forward with workflow. So I just listed a couple of them here on this slide. So one of the features that we are going to add next is process analytics features, which you see with every business process management product or workflow product, where we plan some out-of-the-box dashboards in the workflow console that show you the progress of workflow instances in a more visual way. Then we are planning to add process collaboration to allow different workflows to exchange messages, to exchange data via message exchange. In general, we are taking the workflow more into the direction of case management, because we want to support more event and data-driven workflows. So today in 23.2, we started with simple workflows where you have activities connected via transitions. Going forward, we want a more dynamic approach where activities can become active if certain data conditions evaluate to true, or if external events are coming in. Then we have the database team. The database team implemented core database features specifically for workflow. And this is the Saga and escrow feature, which will allow us to, really give better transactional guarantees when it comes to orchestrating work in the workflow. And that is a unique proposition that only Apex Workflow has. I don't know of any other implementation, because it's all in the database. This also allows us interoperability with external microservices that, for example, are deployed on Graal.cloud or on Spring Boot service. Coming back to the Q&A, there were a couple of questions regarding how is Apex Workflow, how do you compare it with Flows for Apex? So part of it I answered already, but and we will release a position paper in more detail about it, but here's the short answer on that. If there are customers out there that have an existing business process management practice based on BPMN 2.0 standard, then those customers should use Flows for Apex. If there are customers outside that start with workflow, or they do not have requirements to use BPMN 2.0, this is what Apex Workflow is for. So the basic answer is, it's a customer choice. Apex Workflow does not and will not implement BPMN 2.0, because we are moving more into the direction of case management semantics. So there will be, we will have two workflow implementations in Apex, one native one, which is the Apex Workflow, and we continue to support Flows for Apex, and we make it easy to do process collaboration, for example, between BPMN 2.0 Flows for Apex processes and Apex workflows. I hope that answers that question a little bit. And what else? Yeah, so I mean, there is a long journey ahead of us where we want to bring many more features into Apex Workflow. What Ananya showed you today is just the beginning, and we are looking forward to implement many more features. And we, of course, are also interested in getting feedback from you guys on what do you need, what is important for you. So please give us feedback on this.
I have one more slide over here. Let me just yeah, so we just wanted to mention that we do have some workflow resources already out there for folks who are interested. We have 2 blogs already out. One which talks about this very same medical appointment scenario, through a series of blogs on how to create your application with the complete workflow, as I have demonstrated in today's office hours. And there is one more with how to use action tasks in Apex 23.2. Hope you will take a look at it, and please come back with questions and provide us feedback on this.
So one thing that seems to have come up is that some of the users have actually used this app. They've created users in the app, but they don't know how to categorize the users as doctors, staff, patients, and so forth under managed users. Is that a shortcoming of the app?
So this was just a demo scenario. It's just like any other app users. So workflow is not about categorizing the users at all, but it is to find out who are the actors in your business process. So the user can be anybody here.
Okay.
It's very similar to how we have done it for task definitions. We have not categorized users as such, but the source of your users can be any table. You can have a patient's table. In case of an employee onboarding scenario, it will be a different kind of table altogether. So this is just for a demo purpose.
I hope everyone had a very interesting time learning more about this feature. Thank you, Ananya, for walking us through that awesome demonstration. And Ralph, also, thank you for answering some of these questions. I know it's been quite a furious time there typing a lot of the responses. We've had almost 40 questions here. And I mean, it really is. It still continues to be an exciting time to be an Apex developer, and just keeps getting better and better. I'm very excited for Apex 23.2 release, which is going to be coming very soon. Remember, we're on a twice-a-year release cycle, spring and fall. Here we are in fall, and a new version of Apex is about to be released. Beyond that, just stay tuned. Also, do make an effort to participate on the Apex community forum at apex@oracle.com/forum. Post your questions about workflow. Ask the team for help. Ask the community for help. Maybe there'll be an opportunity to review other questions other community members have posted, and you can help answer. Just get involved and be part of making every feature of Apex better and better with each new release. So other than that, I think we've reached time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us live. This recording will be available in a couple of weeks, just like the previous recording. It's coming, and we have another few sessions lined up next week and the week after, and so forth. And then as we finish this 5-part series, we will resume our once-a-month Apex office hours to continue with new deep dives on features that are new in Apex 23.2 and maybe even more specific topics. So beyond that, I'm Jason Haynes. It's great to have you on the call. And thank you, everyone that participated in asking questions. And especially thank you to the team that helped answer these questions. Till next time. Bye, everyone. Have a great week.